Okay, we are live. Welcome aboard, everybody. This is Gary Wilson, and welcome to tonight's live investor agent training webinar. And welcome aboard also to everybody who's been through any of the other training programs, whether it's flipping for profits, rental problems without the pain, or turning rental problems into real estate profits. That's the property manager course. So welcome aboard. Particularly welcome aboard to all the new folks. A little bit of housekeeping here. You will see that you have a question box. Initially, that's how we ask questions. So we use the question box to do that, and I answer them every now and then. I can and will unmute some of you. All right, and we'll go live, and it'll be audio as well, and everybody can hear it. Let's see. We are nearing the end of the year here, and I want to give you an update. Next week, I've got a special guest. His name is Tuan Than. He's from Las Vegas. He's in one of my mastermind groups, and he's a financial planner, and he's pro real estate, and he has a lot of customers who are Asian, and one of them happens to be a member of the Asian Investors of America. So I'm going to be speaking to that group when I'm in Las Vegas in February. But in any case, Tuan is going to come on next week, and he has a program or process he's going to give you. He's going to show you how it works, how to use it, and then give it to you to give to your clients. I mean, you can give it to them all year round, but particularly right now at Christmas time, it's a great thing you can do to offer to send to your clients as a sort of a Christmas gift, if you will, or Hanukkah, whichever the case may be. So you definitely want to be on next week. Beverly should probably promote that a little bit this coming week to get more interest. And by the way, Tuan is a very good guy. When I was a kid, my family and my church sponsored Vietnamese refugees, and he escaped from Vietnam. He's got a really interesting story about him and himself and his family, and a little bit heartbreaking, but also some good stuff there. So got to meet his kids and everything. He's a great guy. So in any case, keep an eye out for that. Also coming up here, I'm in Alabama this week. I will be in Atlanta the next 2 weeks. So if any of you guys are on from Atlanta, Lev Mills and I are looking to get a group together while I'm there. We'll meet at one of the market centers after class, maybe grab a pizza, something like that. So if you're from Atlanta, keep an eye out for that, and let us know if you have an interest in it. Just send me a text message or email, okay? Okay, so let's dig into some content here tonight. First thing is I want to go over a couple questions we had, and I apologize, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, but one of the questions I realized I should have turned on a recording before I answered it. And the question is, or the comment is are some of the investor clubs somewhat, agent averse? And the answer is yes, some of them are. Not completely. In fact, you'll have a mixture of investors there and other service providers, like lenders, like lawyers, like inspectors, different contractors. Pest control. Everybody, all the vendors are represented at the investor clubs. I'm going to use RIA as our standard acronym. RIA stands for Real Estate Investors of America, and the reason is they're the largest in North America. And I used to be an active member. I'm going to renew my my membership because I've been speaking for those groups, and I'm starting to pick up on that again. So in any case, let's just say RIA represents all investor clubs. Some investor clubs are more aggressive and progressive than others, some less. I've been in some pretty sizable groups where they're like, hey, they see us as a valuable member of their team when they're doing it correctly, okay? So there's been a movement in the last decade, really a decade and a half, I guess, to realize the team concept and the fact that a realtor is every bit as valuable, if not more valuable, than some of the other vendors in a group, okay? So good question. And the fact is if you're new to the group, you always want to position yourself uniquely. You don't want to go in there with just a standard real estate business card. You want to go in with information and tools. Bring stuff into that shows people you're not just talking, you're walking. You don't just tell them what they can do and what you can do for them. You actually show them and demonstrate them. Bring your computer, bring in examples, bring in blank forms and hand them out like candy. Okay. That's how you're going to differentiate yourself, right? And if you've got some case studies, some other investors you've helped, bring in some printouts of those deals, okay? So a good question, Debbie. Thank you very much for that. Okay, the other question is, or one of the other questions is, the potential increase in interest rates. You know, nobody has a crystal ball. There's been times in the last 4 to 5 years where we were predicting interest rate increases, and it just didn't happen. In fact, there have been situations where they've actually decreased the rates even further. So I've just learned to not really ever prognosticate. However, there is a pretty good sense with Donald Trump going to be the president here, it appears, and with his pro-business attitude, that we're going to likely see some interest rate increases because there'll likely be inflation, and inflation is a direct result of increased GDP. So just a brief little explanation here. GDP has been anemic in this last expansion. So in other words, if you look at this past recession that started back in 2007, the recovery that started, you know, probably say around 2012, all right, depending on where you are in the country. The recovery phase we've been in, which has now been going on for 4 to 5 years, has been the least productive of all expansions after a recession. And there's a number of reasons. I mean, the biggest one is that we just really don't have. We've been printing too much money without the sufficient backing. In other words, we're basically been supporting the economy artificially, and people know that, and the money people know that, and the rest of the world knows it too. So that's been kind of an issue. Our credit rating has dropped for the first time in history. So there's a number of factors behind all this, but regardless, it looks like the direction we're taking is instead of increasing taxes, there's likely going to be some tax cuts. Could be individual, could be business, could be a combination. I don't know. I'm telling you that we're going to have some tax cuts. All right, and what that does is that frees up capital to remain in circulation, to remain in production that can be used to generate more commerce, to build infrastructure, to build business, to hire people. So what that means is that it increases GDP. So historically, whenever you see one administration lower taxes, you'll see a boom. You'll see an increase in business activity, increase in hiring, and that naturally generates inflation. It's just part of the game. It's not that it's a bad thing. It just is. Okay, so that's what's going to generate increased interest rates. You increase interest rates to help counter the effect of inflation. That's what they do. That's one of the tools they use. So what does that do to us? Well, for the owner-occupant business, historically it could slow things down. But I will tell you, if you look at the history of interest rates, guys, what we've been seeing the last 4 to 5 years have been the lowest interest rates we've seen in 50 years, since the 1960s. So as interest rates increased in the 60s, it really didn't hamper real estate, people buying and selling homes that much. At least in the beginning, it didn't start to have an effect until the 70s, and definitely in the 80s it did, because in the 80s, the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, we had the 18% interest rates, 20% interest rates, and people had to get real creative with real estate. So the volume of transactions had dropped, but transactions were still occurring because people were getting creative with their financing, all right? So that's very extreme, very dramatic. When I started investing, I was paying 9%. We thought that was great, So relatively speaking, let's say we went up to 4%, 5%, 6%. Historically speaking, that's not bad. Now, consumers are the ones who are going to see that as being, holy smokes, I was going to pay 3% in 2016, and now I'm going to pay 6%. That's just horrible. But investors who know the game are going to look at that and say, you know what, 6% is still very favorable relative to historical averages. And not only that, investors do the analysis, the financial analysis on a property, and they look at the cash flow. They look at the cap rate and look at the cash on cash return. So what a long way of me answering your question, Tasha, is this. You could see a slowdown in the owner-occupant business. I don't think it's going to be that dramatic, if at all. if interest rates go up to 4% and 5%, because people, you know, that's a great deal. That's an excellent interest rate, all right? But if it shows up, it's going to show up in the residential world. In the investor world, what investors do is they just look at the property, look at the opportunity, and structure the deal according to the criteria and the terms that are existing in the current economy. You know, investors always find a way. We don't care if the economy's up, down, left, right. It just doesn't matter. We still chug right along. So if you're focusing on investors, I honestly wouldn't worry about it. That's been my experience, and I've been doing this since the 80s, so I've been through a couple of cycles. But with the owner occupants, I have seen slowdowns in the past, but generally it was when there were more dramatic increases in rates, like going up to 8, 9, and 10%. You know, that's when we saw slowdowns, not at the 3, 4, and 5% range. Okay. And okay, so I hope that answers your question there. And at the end of the day, I will say this: you just have to wait and see. And good entrepreneurs always improvise, adapt, and overcome. No matter what, we always find a way. All right. So, okay, let's see. I think there was another question there. Let's see. Second item to potentially discuss is IRS 425 or 469 rule, which talks about real estate professionals that might qualify for the passive activity loss if they own rental properties and spend 750 hours as a real estate agent broker. And I think, let's see, is that, hey Natasha, believe it or not, that's not the first time that's come up, and I'm really not qualified to provide commentary on that, other than to say it's come up before and it's never been passed. You know, certainly as real estate agents, we're considered professionals, and we had this what's similar to what we call dealer status. So as we earn income from commissions, that's earned income, and we have to pay Social Security tax on that, and income tax and some other stuff, all right? Income from rental properties is considered passive income, always has, and at least for the moment still is. You know, if I won't provide a lot of commentary, Natasha, but I will give you my personal opinion. I'm an investor and a broker. Okay, now on my rental income, obviously I don't pay Social Security tax on that. Right, I only pay income tax on that. So the big question is could the government construe, could the IRS construe passive income as being earned income because we are already professional real estate professionals by virtue of the fact that we have a license? You know, I say the answer is no, because the nature of the income is completely different. Passive income from rentals is not the same as, has the same characteristics as income we get from earning commissions. Two completely different types of activities are involved, and obviously we're heavily involved in the world of agency or earning commissions. When it comes to rental properties, yeah, you might be more involved when you first start out, but by nature it's still passive income. You know, rental income is still passive income. And as you grow your portfolio, you become less and less involved in the daily activities of running those properties. You have other people do that for you, so it truly is passive income. So my opinion is, I don't think we're going to see it, but as far as a commentary or advice, I just can't do that, because there's, you know, who knows what the heck's going to happen. I just don't think it will, because that's a big industry, and there's a lot of people who invest. I mean, the numbers are staggering, and obviously that includes Donald Trump. So, in any case, I know where the question is coming from, because it's popped up, and it's certainly a matter of discussion. It may find its way in front of Congress. I just don't think it's going to change. Would be shocked if it did. So, in any case, let me see here if I got to any other questions here. You're welcome, Debbie. Herminia. Hi, Herminia. I just see a black screen. Here, Herminia, there must be something on your end, because it looks like everybody's able to. I mean, I'm seeing it myself, and everybody seems to be seeing it. You might try a refresh. I'm not sure when you logged in what happened when you logged in. I wish I could help you there more directly, but I'll tell you what, let's try a refresh, Herminia. All I have is the intro page. Let's see here. Is that Herminia again? That's somebody else. Let me see who KA is. Hang on one second, guys. I'm not sure. Well, regardless. Oh, Karen. Hey, Karen Rose. Yeah, the screen you should be seeing should say at the top, it should say XII, Roman numeral 12, rent, sell, in parentheses, flip, comma, or lease option. If you have apples, that might be kind of a quandary there, but there are instructions to follow for people who are Apple users. I know a number of you are Apple users on you. You've already done that months before. But send an email to Beverly. She'll hook you up with Paul. We'll get you the recording. I would listen tonight. You'll get the recording tomorrow, so you get the visual. And more importantly, you can get instructions for how to use GoToWebinar on an Apple or Mac if that's the case. So let me reduce this panel here and go back to the question box. And I apologize, I can't offer any more direct support right now. I'm not a technician. Okay, all right. So let's get started here, guys. On the back to the wholesaling, so we can wrap this up. I'm going to reduce my screen so I can't see questions here for a moment, and then we will bring the panel back over and look for questions. All right, first things first. So we've gone through 2 sessions of wholesaling. At this point, let's say we're working with the client. We've got everything under contract. The client's done their marketing, and no buyer's coming forward. Nobody's going to buy the contract and then eventually buy the property. So what do? Well, there are a couple options. Okay. If you're the wholesaler, perhaps you might be able to pull the magic bunny out of your hat and get this thing get this thing closed. Actually, get it to the closing table. Or in the case of your client, maybe they bring in a partner, something like that. Instead of wholesaling it, instead of selling the contract, they actually do buy the property. Okay, and if you think about it, it is a valid opportunity, an option, because you wouldn't be wholesaling the property if you didn't yourself think it was a good deal. All right. So, assuming you've done everything correctly, you've got a good deal here. You don't want to see it go away, and then the seller is upset and they're harmed them in some way because of this. So let's say there's some way to pull this through, and you get the thing where you can purchase it. 2 options are you can remodel it and sell it as a flip, or you can keep it as a rental. All right. But I want to talk about that a little bit, because when you go into a transaction, whether you're buying it with the intention of going forward with the purchase, or you're wholesaling it, you need to know what the ultimate game is. Is this going to be a flip property, or is this going to be a rental property? And you have to understand it at the outset, and it has to be the goal. And the reason I'm emphasizing this so much is let's say, okay, you get the property in a contract, and your intention is to, remodel the property, and you were going to keep it to rent, all right? But you decide you're going to now flip it. That's actually not as big a deal as you might think. And the reason is it's easier to go from buying a property with the intention of renting it and changing your game plan to decide to flip it. The reason is you haven't put a lot of money into the property that you wouldn't normally get out of it, all right? In other words, you can flip a rental property quite easily. In fact, there's an entire strategy behind it. I don't know if I have time to go into it tonight. Maybe I'll do that next week. But people flip rentals just like they flip single-family homes. And what you do is you remodel the property using standard workmanship and materials that are in alignment with rental properties. You get the property rented out, so you get it fully occupied, showing an income, and then you sell it for profit. Okay. In other words, it's an excellent strategy. Instead of just flipping single-family homes that people are going to live in, to purchase and live in owner-occupants, you can buy properties with the intention of it being a rental, but you end up flipping it at the end of the day anyways, because you rent it for so much money that the cap rate looks pretty juicy, the cash-on-cash return looks juicy, the place is remodeled, and you could possibly make a good turn a good profit on that. Okay, so that's the good news. All right. Now, on the other hand, let's say the intention was to flip the property, and you decide later on you want to change your strategy and you want to keep it and rent it. The challenge is let's say you've been remodeling the property, right? You're going down the road, you're going to flip it, you're remodeling it, you're putting in new carpeting, new cabinetry, you know, new windows, new doors, the whole 9 yards, new roofing, new deck. And then later on you decide you're going to keep it and rent it, all right? Because maybe it's not selling like you thought it would. The challenge is when you remodel a property for flipping, you're more than likely going to use more expensive material. The craftsmanship's going to cost you more money. All right. In other words, the rehab project's going to be more expensive on a flip than it typically is on a rental. All things considered the same. Let's say you got two properties side by side. One's going to be flipped. One's going to be rented. All right. In other words, one's going to be flipped to an owner-occupant. One's going to be held for renting purposes. They both needed the same types of repairs. All right. They both had the same deferred maintenance. You would spend more money on flipping a property for an owner-occupant than you would remodeling a property that's going to be held for rentals, because the materials will be different. More expensive on the flip for owner-occupants, less expensive on the remodeling for renting. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is, if you go down the pathway, if you purchase a property, you're spending money on remodeling, and you decide at the end of the day you're going to rent it, the rents might not justify the cost basis. Cost basis being purchase plus remodeling, if the original intention was to sell it to an owner-occupant. Okay, so that's the risk. In other words, you can switch strategies going from flipping to rental more easily than you can switch strategies going from renting to flipping. So I want to make sure that makes sense here. I'm going to give you a little bit more information here, and then I'll pull the panel back over for questions. But basically what I'm going over here is, in the material, the description of what this looks like and how you react to it. By the way, if you haven't already, you should get the book Flipping for Profits Without the Risk. Okay, the title in here is the old title. You'll get the new title, right? So in any case, let's say you do that. All right, let's say you got a house, and in this case you were gonna rent it. You decided to sell it. All right. If you're not a licensee, you might want to get a licensee to do that. And this goes back to Debbie, your question. The reason is a licensee generally will be able to attract a larger audience and command a higher price, all right, on average, for a property that you're selling through a real estate company. People who do for sale by owner often do not fully realize the full profit potential on a property, because they're just not as qualified. They don't have the same tools we have, all right? So let's say this was the case. Let's say you decide you're going to flip it. You want to approach this on the marketing end of things like a consumer would when they're going to go buy their own home. This is you're going to decide to flip it. You're going to get it marketed. You want to actually go through the process that a consumer would go through to look at the property, starting out by driving down the street and observing and seeing. Well, you see, what does that, does it catch your eye? Does this property catch your eye above all other properties on that street? If it's newly remodeled, you would hope that it would, right? So hopefully the impression is good. What does the mailbox look like? What does the sidewalk look like? What does the front door and the storm door look like? Okay, are you filled with anticipation to grab that doorknob to open it up? And you should be, all right? In fact, if you think about it, this is one of the most critical points of showing a property. When someone grabs that doorknob, that's the first physical contact with the property. It's a big deal, and there's some psychology behind it, but just trust me, it's a big deal. Okay, so you've got to change your strategy here. You're not thinking in terms of rental now you're thinking in terms of flip. And to go back to my discussion earlier about the cost of remodeling and the materials and the workmanship, here's how it really plays out. All right, let's say you decide you're gonna cut some corners and save a buck. Here's what happens. Let's say you do a quick $10 fix. Most consumers have powerful enough, their powers of observation are good enough that they can tell that you took a shortcut. And what's going to happen is, psychologically, their mind's going to be going down a spiral a negative spiral of wondering, well, if you took a shortcut here on this small thing, you used a $10 doorknob versus a $25 doorknob, what else did you cut corners on? What else could be wrong with the property? And that's their mindset. They're going to be looking for other things to be wrong with the property. And if that negative state of mind is hard to overcome, you're going to get lower offers. It's just, for those of you who've been around the business for a while, you know what I'm talking about. But it happens. It's a psychological phenomenon that's very difficult to overcome. Now, on the other hand, let's say you took the extra step. So you were going to spend $25 on a doorknob and you decided to spend $35 on a doorknob. That extra $10 could actually have a positive effect on a potential buyer. In other words, they look at that and are thinking, geez, you went the extra mile on something small like that. What else should you go the extra mile on? And they start looking for things and basically validating their impression that you really dressed this place out to the nines. You did an excellent job remodeling. There's probably nothing wrong with the place because you took care of the little details, all right? So in other words, it's that spiral, but in a positive upward motion, all right? It's an interesting psychological phenomenon. If you've ever experienced, you know what I'm talking about. But what I'm getting at here is if you're going to take this property on, you got to think of the consumer. And you really got to, this goes back to the beginning of the class tonight, the webinar tonight. You got to really be certain of your strategy and stick to it as best you can. If you have to switch strategies, just bear in mind, it's easier to go from flipping for owner occupants to remodeling for rental than it is to go from remodeling for rental to flipping for owner occupants, okay? So two different strategies. You can go back and forth. I shouldn't try to persuade you one way or the other. Just bear in mind, if you go from flipping where you're spending more money to a rental strategy, the rents might not be enough to, in other words, the ends might not justify the means. Okay, now let me pause for questions here because I'm going to go into lease options, which is a hybrid approach, and it's the final approach that we'll go over. But I want to make sure everybody's, hang on one second. Let me get my arrow pointed correctly here. Okay, it looks like we're okay on questions. Yeah, I think we're okay on questions. All right, so lease options. I'm going to reduce my panel, guys, so you're not going to be able to, I'm not going to be able to see your questions for a moment. All right, so let me get this queued up correctly here. Oops, lost my, there it is. Whoops, I'm all over the place. Okay, hang on one second, we'll get there. Okay, lease options. Well, I'm getting this queued up. What a lease option is, it's really a hybrid approach, okay? Some of you may know what it is, but it's very applicable to our circumstances here, all right? So what this is let's say you have a property, the contract, the wholesaling part of the game didn't work out. You or your client were not able to sell the contract. You couldn't assign it and make a wholesale fee. You decide to purchase it, you or your client, or somehow or other you get it purchased, you remodel it for the intention of flipping it. Now, what happens is all of a sudden something changes in the economy. Interest rates bump up a little bit, like we were discussing earlier. Or you head into the winter months and the business slows down. And all of a sudden you've got this nice newly remodeled property there that's not moving, it's not selling. You know that you can rent it, but maybe the rents don't justify the overall, the cost basis of the property, which is what we just discussed earlier. And that's why now, if you're wondering why I was discussing all that, here's why. I'm leading you down to this point right here. This is a good option if all else fails, all right? Or it's another approach you can take to keep the train on the tracks. So what happens is you do actually rent the property out, but you're not doing a rent to own. And you're not just doing a straight lease. You're going to have two parts of this, the lease and an option to purchase, okay? So prospective consumer will lease the property on maybe a one-year basis, a one-year term, with the intention of purchasing the property. And what you do to make that more official and to make it basically hold their feet to the fire is you have them purchase what's called an option agreement. Okay, this option agreement gives them the option to purchase the property at a future date. All right, so you have a lease. That's part one. So there's two parts to this. The lease is part one. It's a standard lease. They're going to rent it for a year. Okay. By the way, one benefit of this approach is you generally can command a higher rent when you do lease options. So right out of the gate, you're appeasing your investor, your client, to say, look, I know we're talking about leasing it here, but I'm telling you, here's how you can get more rent, and here's how you do it. Lease options. So lease for more money initially, all right, and then you also have the person leasing the property, the renter, execute what's called an option agreement. In other words, they indicate that they want to buy the property, but maybe they don't have the money for a down payment now. Maybe their credit is not as good as it needs to be. So the option agreement is not a sales agreement. The option agreement is simply just as it's stated. It gives the purchaser the right to purchase the property they're now renting, at a future date at a predetermined price. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Why would people do this? Well, let's talk about the owner. The owner of the property, might not want to be stuck with this property, and maybe they don't want to just do a standard lease. If they choose a lease option, they can lease the property to someone who is more highly motivated to eventually purchase the property. They also will be more highly motivated to pay all their rent on time, okay? Because this owner is going to be that renter's best creditor for a year. That tenant typically is not going to have a bigger monthly bill than rent. So you document it for a year that this tenant has paid rent every month faithfully on time in full, okay? Now back to the owner. So they get a property rented to a person who's going to treat it like as if it was their own property. In other words, they know they're going to purchase it. They're going to start living in there and treating it and acting as if they actually own it, all right? Because they do think they're going to own it eventually, and they may in fact own it eventually. Some other good benefits to the owner. You typically have the tenant pay all utilities, all bills, everything, including even the insurance bill. Okay, now what you do is you pay the insurance bill and you have the tenant reimburse it. If you really want to get advanced, you can do this in certain places like up in New York, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, where they're it's more aggressive up there. It's more expensive. You can do what's called a triple net lease, and the tenant would even pay for the property taxes, right? I wouldn't go that far, but I know people that do that. So in any case, so back to the owner. The other benefit obviously is this, that the tenant has the intention to purchase the property at the end of the lease term. So at the end of the year, the owner is eventually going to get the property sold, no doubt about it, all right? But here's something else. The option fee is non-refundable, okay? The option fee is not a down payment. It does not go towards the purchase of the property. What it is they're purchasing the right to have first right of refusal on that property. In other words, the owner, the downside of the owner is they can't entertain any other purchaser throughout that year. They have to hold the property off the market for that tenant to get their ducks in a row, so that tenant has a first option to purchase the property. But let's say that tenant ends up not purchasing the property. The owner gets to keep the option fee, because all it was a fee, a purchase price of the option document. That's all it was. Another important point here is this. If you notice, we're doing a lease option. We're not doing a rent to own. Rent to own is not a good deal, guys. And the reason is typically you're applying some portion of their down. They're going to give you a larger down payment, not an option fee, but an actual deposit. Most owners of a rent to own are intending to take a portion of that initial down payment or deposit to apply towards the purchase of the property. And furthermore, they're applying a portion of the monthly rent to the purchase price too. So here's the downside of that. Yeah, you might be doing the tenant a favor by allowing them to accumulate a certain amount of money in the form of a deposit that can be used as a down payment when you do get financing. Okay, that sounds good, and that's good for the tenant. But let's say the tenant ends up not purchasing the property. In fact, they default and they default on the lease too. They stop paying rent because they realize, hey, I can't pay this thing. I'm going to stop paying rent and just eventually move. Well, let's say that happens and you or your owner have to go to court, and you're thinking you're going to go to file a landlord or tenant complaint and start the eviction process. But what happens is, as soon as it goes to court in front of the judge is going to raise his hand and say, wait a second, this is a rent to own. I can't hear this case because as long as even just $1 has been applied towards the purchase price of the property, that tenant now has what's called one of the rights of ownership, which is equity. They have a degree of equity in the property. They own $1 of that property, and in this case, obviously, it's going to be probably more like a few hundred or a few thousand. But it doesn't matter. All it has to be is $1. So if you applied $1 of rent towards the purchase price, and that tenant defaults on the lease, you can't just evict them. You have to do what's called foreclose on them. Now, some really bad news here is this. An eviction, generally you can do in about 30 to 45 days. It's longer in some areas like New York, New Jersey, shorter in other areas like Florida, okay? The big problem is this. The judge is going to say you got to go to the court of common pleas because this is now a foreclosure, because that tenant is not just a tenant. That tenant actually has an equitable interest in the property. Foreclosures currently right now are taking about 13 months minimum. That's minimum, guys. The average is a lot longer than that. And I keep picking on New York. It's only because I just spent a few months up there, and I have family up there too. I know of foreclosures in New York that have taken 4, even 6 years for a foreclosure to finally go through. Now, let's face it. Would you rather have a 30-day eviction or a 4-year foreclosure? Let's just say it's 13 months. Let's just compare 1-month eviction to a 13-month foreclosure, where clearly the 1-month eviction is much more palatable, much less expensive, and much less damaging. So if I didn't talk you out of rent-to-owns before, I probably just did it now. Just remember, rent-to-owns has some very serious inherent negative aspects to them, okay, versus a lease option. Lease option, not one dime of rent goes towards the purchase. Not one dime of the option fee goes towards the purchase either. So that tenant has no equitable interest in the property. So if a lease option tenant defaults on the lease, you just simply evict them. That's all it is, and you keep the option fee. So it's a wonderful, wonderful way to sell a house. Both parties have some pros. Both parties have some cons. Again, the owner is going to have to take the property off the market. They can't entertain any other person, excuse me, while the option period is open. Okay, as soon as the option period closes, that owner can do one of two things. They can extend the option period and charge a fee for that. They can offer a brand new option to the same person and charge a brand new fee for that. Or they can say, I'm sorry, this isn't working out. You'll have to leave by the end of the month. And that owner now has there's 3 more choices. They can again try to sell the house. They can just simply rent it out, or they can try another lease option. And the reason I mention that is, and some of you are probably wondering, well, Gary, why would they do that again if it didn't work the first time? Well, it depends on how you look at it. Remember, they got an option fee. Maybe it was $5,000 that they got to keep. And in the meantime had rented the house for typically higher than market rents to a family who was treating it like it was their own home because they thought they were going to purchase it to live there. So you get your property back generally in better condition. You get the option fee, and you had higher rents the whole time. So why wouldn't you do it again? I have had houses, guys. I leased option as many as 3 times before I eventually did actually sell. Never had a problem, and actually did that. I actually had optionees pay me 2 or more option fees because they were determined to buy that house. Okay. So there's some obvious benefits and a few cons you need to think of. In any case, I wanted to give you that strategy to consider. I want to bring my panel back over and look for some questions here. So let me give you a second to type in your questions if you have any. Okay, let's see what we got here. Hang on one second. This should generate some interest because a lot of people are not real clear on how lease options actually work. So, in any case, let me look and see. Okay, here we go. This is from, what would the range of the option fee be? Good question. On a percentage basis, we generally recommend 5%. Now, the challenge is, if you're in an area where the average home price is $500,000, you're now talking about $25,000 for an option fee. That certainly can be done. It's just going to be, more difficult because I don't care where you are. $25,000 is a whole lot more than, say, $5,000 in an area where the average home price is only $100,000. However, I would always start at 5%. I would always start there first. You can always negotiate your way down if you want to. But let's face it. Let's say you're in an area where the average home price is $500,000. All right, and the person is they're based on their current circumstances. The lenders are telling them they need to have 20% down. Well, that would mean they would have to have $100,000 in the case of a $500,000 property. Okay. So in that regard, $25,000 doesn't sound nearly as bad as $100,000. And maybe the person has $25,000. Maybe they got $50,000. Maybe they're halfway there. Okay. What you can do is still lease the property to them. They pay you rent, typically higher rents. Okay. They purchase the option agreement. They purchase the right or the option to purchase the property at a later date. Okay. So they're getting some benefit there. And maybe they got something coming in the next year. Maybe they're getting a court settlement, okay? Or it could be anything, workman's comp, divorce, an estate that was settled. You'd be amazed at how many people have these events going on in their lives, and it's just a matter of time before they get the settlement. But in the case of a divorce, they might think it's going to be a month, but it ends up being a year. So what you do is you offer them the property. They're glad to do it because maybe it's the house they want. It's the one they definitely want. They don't want to look any further. They just need to tie it up temporarily until they can get their settlement, and then they complete the purchase of the property. So don't ever underestimate or second guess or wonder what somebody else might be thinking. Put it out there because you don't know who's going to take advantage of this opportunity, and it happens an awful lot, guys. So in any case, that's a good question, by the way. I would say in a descending economy, you might want to bend a little bit and go a little bit lower on your option fees, the actual dollar amount. In a climbing economy where people are still digging out, you could be a little bit more aggressive, okay? So, in any case, that's it for that part of the discussion. Let me go back here and see if there's anything else. We talked about, oops, that moved way too fast here. Hang on a second. Let me just make sure I covered everything the way I wanted to. All right, let's see. Okay, we talked about that. We talked about don't do a rent to own. Okay, remember there's multiple rights to ownership. There's like something called contractual equity. Of course, there's actual monetary equity. All right, and that's where we talked about rent to own not being a good option because it gives somebody actual equity in a property. Okay, one of the multiple ownership rights. We talked about the mechanics of how that works. In your option period, by the way, I'm sorry, that was another question I didn't get back to. The option period is typically a year. Now, theoretically, you want to make your option period as short as possible. 6 months, 3 months, what have you. However, I've seen options that go out as long as 3 years. If you look back at the last recession, by the time 2008 hit, it was pretty obvious we were in for a big, big hit. And I saw option periods going out 3 years. That made sense in that economy. So you have to think in terms of where we are right now. We got people feeling really good about things, and we got people thinking we're headed for the mother of all recessions, even a depression. I don't know. All I know is I like being on a cash basis. because you can't go wrong being on a cash basis. I don't like debt. I never have liked debt. I know it sounds crazy because I used to have a lot of debt, but I paid it all off, and life's a lot more pleasant now. So I don't really care so much what the economy does. Um, I just keep chugging right along, you know. So in any case, back to this. The option term is a critical thing right now. 1 year is about what I would recommend. Um, if the economy really takes off, I would say shorten it to 6 months. If the economy heads for a recession, and I'll just tell you, I think that's where we're going. Um, you might stretch those terms out. So in any case, let's go back to this. Risk is the big thing with lease options because you typically have less risk of property damage because you're generally renting to people who do intend to buy the property. They want to obviously, you know, keep it up. So, by the way, another thing to think about, let's say your optionee does not exercise the option, but they want to stay in the house. You can offer them a new option again. You can at that point raise the price of the property that they're going to be locked into. So let's say you're in a lease option on a $200,000 property, and the first option said that in a year they can purchase the property for $200,000. Let's say the option period expires, the year expires, they can't purchase it, but they still want to purchase it. They just need another year. You can not only raise the price of the property, you can raise the option amount, you can even raise the lease amount, you can raise the rent. So you see what I'm saying here? Just because a property doesn't sell through a lease option, you still have multiple opportunities to profit in the case when it doesn't actually sell at the end of the lease period. Okay, so just a few things to think about there. Let's see here. What else is there anything else I want to go over in this? I think that was pretty much it. Just really just words of wisdom here. I would tell you to be creative, guys. Think outside the box. Always remember, wherever there's a lemon, there's a potential glass of lemonade. All right. You know, God doesn't want us to just survive; He wants us to thrive. So you've got to really have faith and take action. You know, just remember, millions of people have gone before you. You know, we start talking more about wholesaling because people see what's happening in the economy and they hear what they think is going to happen in the economy. Wholesaling is a good thing. It's just one more option for you to turn a profit for you and your clients. You can wholesale yourself. You can help your clients wholesale. If you're a licensee, wholesaling, just remember there's certain rules you have to follow. In any case, that's pretty much it, guys. Let me bring my panel back over one more time. If there's no questions, we will wrap this up for the night, and we will look forward to next week with Tuan, and that is going to be, what night is that? That's going to be next Wednesday, the 14th. So, okay, guys, I appreciate you participating. We had a good turnout tonight. If this is the first webinar you've been on, or you've been on for a while but you missed the last two, I highly recommend you get the last two webinars so you have a much clearer and thorough picture of wholesaling, okay? And also send me emails about what other subjects we want to talk about. After the holidays, we're going to start all over again with all the marketing. We'll start back at the beginning of the program and work our way through. It'll take about 6 months, okay? So, in any case, you guys take care of yourselves. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and I hope you're enjoying the Christmas season, Hanukkah, if you celebrate Hanukkah, if you celebrate Kwanzaa. Please send me cards electronically if you want. I like to get them all. I honor whatever practice you participate in. I I benefited from all of them, especially at Christmas time, and also when I was growing up. I love getting cards from different spiritual practices. So mine just happens to be Christmas, and so I wish you all a happy holiday season and a Merry Christmas if that's the case. Happy Kwanzaa, happy Hanukkah. If you celebrate none of those, I just hope you enjoy the season with your family, okay? So God bless you all, and we will see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.